In the year 2019, a researcher at the University of Vienna drilled into a petrous bone recovered from a necropolis just outside Rome. It is the densest bone in the human body, lodged deep behind the ear, holding genetic material for thousands of years in conditions that would destroy every other biological trace. The powder from that tiny fragment was sequenced, compared against thousands of genomes, ancient and modern. And what it revealed contradicted almost everything we assumed about who the Italian people really are. For generations, Italians believed they knew their story. The descendants of the Romans who built the roads, the aqueducts, the empire. That story felt unshakable. It wasn't. What ancient DNA uncovered was not a bloodline. It was a 12,000-year archaeological site of human migration. 5 seismic ruptures, each one rewriting the genetic identity of the peninsula completely. To understand what fell apart, you first have to understand why the clean story survived so long. For most of the 20th century, the story of Italy was told through language, pottery, and written records. It was a clean story. The Romans spoke Latin, an Indo-European tongue that spread across the Western world. The Etruscans spoke something else entirely, a language that linguists still cannot fully decipher despite decades of trying. The Greeks colonized the south, founding cities like Syracuse and Naples. The Gauls settled the Po Valley in the north. And after Rome fell, the Lombards and other Germanic peoples swept in from beyond the Alps. The narrative was tidy. It matched the archaeology. It made intuitive sense. Underneath all of it sat one foundational assumption: that modern Italians were more or less the genetic descendants of the Romans who built the roads and the aqueducts, that the deep biological identity of the peninsula had been established during antiquity, and that everything which followed, the Lombard conquest, the Norman invasion of Sicily, the Arab Emirate, was cultural overlay sitting on top of a stable genetic foundation. Nobody seriously questioned it, because nobody had the technology to test it. Italy's regional differences seemed to confirm the whole picture. The visible distinctions between a Neapolitan and a Milanese were understood as ancient tribal echoes stretching back to the Iron Age. Northern Italians descended from Gauls and Lombards, Southern Italians from Greeks and native Italic peoples. Sardinians, a world apart, isolated on their island since antiquity. Every piece seemed to fit. But that last detail, that nobody had the technology to test it, is precisely the mechanism that allowed the assumption to survive unchallenged for so long. Before ancient DNA extraction became reliable in the middle of the 2010s, population genetics could only work with modern samples. Researchers took blood from living Italians, compared genetic marker frequencies, and tried to infer backward through time. The fundamental problem with that approach is that it cannot distinguish between two very different histories that leave similar modern signatures: a population that stayed put for 3,000 years, and one that was replaced twice, but landed in a similar genetic range, look nearly identical when all you have is the endpoint. Early mitochondrial DNA studies compounded the confusion rather than resolving it. A study published in 2007 compared mitochondrial DNA from modern Tuscans to Anatolian populations and found a striking match, which seemed to confirm Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian who had claimed the Etruscans migrated from Lydia in what is now Turkey. That finding rippled through popular science media. The Etruscans were Anatolian immigrants. The father of history was vindicated. Case closed. Except it was not closed. Mitochondrial DNA traces only the maternal line. Mother to daughter to granddaughter, one thin thread of ancestry that ignores everything carried by fathers and misses the vast majority of the genome that actually defines a population's profile. Using it to reconstruct population history is like trying to understand an entire city by interviewing one person per household and asking only about their mother's side. You might catch a signal, but you are missing almost the entire picture. The tool that finally broke the problem open was whole genome sequencing of ancient DNA, pulled from those dense petrous bones behind the inner ear. And when researchers began applying it systematically across the peninsula, the clean story did not bend under the pressure of new evidence. It disintegrated. To see how, you cannot start with Rome. You cannot start with the Etruscans. You have to start with the people who were there first. Modern humans reached the Italian peninsula roughly 45,000 years ago. During the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets buried much of northern Europe under kilometers of frozen silence, Italy served as one of the refugia, the pockets of survivable land where small bands of hunter-gatherers waited out the cold. And when temperatures finally rose and the ice retreated, it was partly from these Italian refugia that human populations re-expanded northward, recolonizing a continent the ice had emptied. These were Europe's original inhabitants, foragers who had lived on the peninsula for tens of thousands of years, shaped by its landscapes, its coastlines, its particular rhythms of survival. Then, around 8,000 years ago, everything changed for the first time. Neolithic farmers, originating from Anatolia and the Near East, arrived on Italian shores and began spreading across the peninsula. This was not a gentle blending of two ways of life. Across Europe, the farming transition involved a near-total replacement of indigenous foragers by incoming agricultural populations, and Italy was no exception. The earliest farming sites appear in Puglia, on the southeastern coast, and from there the agricultural frontier spread in two directions at once, northward along the Adriatic and westward toward the Tyrrhenian coast. Within a few centuries, the genetic signature of the original hunter-gatherers had been reduced to a minority component, typically around 15 to 25% of the genome. Consider what that means. A population that had survived an ice age. A population that had outlasted conditions brutal enough to wipe out most of human Europe. And it was genetically overwhelmed not by war, not by catastrophe, but by the slow, relentless arithmetic of farming communities outbreeding foraging ones. The foragers did not vanish in a single, violent moment. They were simply outnumbered, generation after generation, until their share of the gene pool collapsed to a fraction of what it had been. This is the first of the 5 ruptures, the first complete rewriting of who lived on the peninsula. And it set the pattern for everything that followed, because the people the Romans would one day call their ancestors were not the original Italians at all. They were already a replacement population, layered over the foragers who came before. But one place was largely spared. Sardinia, difficult to reach by sea and far enough from the mainland to avoid the casual migration constantly reshuffling coastal populations, was bypassed by most of what came next. While the rest of the peninsula was overwritten again and again in the millennia that followed, Sardinia held still. And the consequence of that isolation is extraordinary. Modern Sardinians remain, to this day, the closest living Europeans to those original Neolithic farmers, a genetic time capsule surrounded by blue water, preserving in their DNA a portrait of what early European farmers looked like before the next wave arrived and changed everything again. Hold on to Sardinia. It is the control group for the entire story. Every later rupture that swept across the mainland either skipped the island or reached it only faintly, which is why Sardinia, more than any other place in Italy, lets us measure exactly how much the rest of the peninsula was transformed. When researchers want to know how far a Roman or a Milanese or a Sicilian has drifted from those first farmers, Sardinia is the baseline they measure against. The mainland, though, had no such protection. The farmers had barely settled into their fields, barely established the villages and the pottery and the rhythms of a new way of living, before the next wave was already moving toward them, because another wave was coming. The second rupture arrived during the Bronze Age, roughly 5,000 years ago, when populations carrying ancestry from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands stretching north of the Black Sea, began moving into Europe in one of the largest migrations in human prehistory. These were not farmers settling into river valleys. They were mobile pastoralists. They rode horses. They worked bronze. and they spoke the ancestor of nearly every European language alive today. Their genetic fingerprints spread across the continent with extraordinary speed, and Italy, once again, was no exception. The timing can be tracked with real precision. Research has confirmed that steppe-related ancestry reached northern Italy by approximately 2000 BC and had penetrated into central Italy by 1600 BC. It was carried in part by the Bell Beaker cultural complex, a widespread archaeological phenomenon associated with distinctive pottery, with metalwork, and, as ancient DNA now reveals, with a very specific genetic profile. The pottery had always been visible in the ground. What no one could see, until the genomes were read, was the population riding underneath it. Now hold the two waves together, because this is where the textbook story begins to buckle. By the time Rome was traditionally founded, in 753 BC, Central Italians already carried roughly 30% steppe ancestry. Sit with that number. Before a single Roman road had been laid. Before a single Roman law had been written. Before the city on the 7 hills was anything more than a cluster of villages, the people living there had already been genetically transformed twice. First by the Anatolian farmers who overwrote the foragers, then by the steppe pastoralists who rode in from the grasslands. 2 complete population overwrites in 4,000 years, both of them finished and settled long before anyone called themselves a Roman. This is the quiet demolition the steppe data performs. The Romans did not stand at the headwaters of Italian ancestry. They stood downstream of at least 2 enormous migrations that had already remade the peninsula's gene pool before Rome existed as an idea. The bloodline that generations assumed began with the founders of the city was, in truth, already a layered inheritance, an Anatolian foundation with the steppe layer pressed on top of it, by the time the founders arrived. And the steppe migration left more than DNA. It left language. The ancestor of Latin, of Greek, of the Celtic tongues, of nearly every language that would come to dominate Europe, traveled with these pastoralists out of the grasslands. The Indo-European family tree that linguists had spent more than a century reconstructing now had a population attached to it, a real movement of real people carrying their speech across a continent. Wherever significant steppe ancestry appeared in Europe, an Indo-European language tended to appear alongside it. The two seemed to travel together, genes and grammar bound to the same migration. Seemed to. Because there was one population on the peninsula that would break that rule completely, one people who absorbed the steppe ancestry and then, against every expectation, refused to speak an Indo-European language at all. But that contradiction comes later. For now, hold the running tally. The foragers, overwhelmed. The farmers, layered over by the steppe. 2 ruptures down, and Rome has not yet been founded. The clean story said the Italian people were forged in antiquity, in the age of Rome, and the cultures around it. The DNA says the peninsula had already been emptied and refilled twice over before antiquity even began. And of all the cultures the next chapter would test, none was more anticipated, none more mysterious, than the people who spoke the great unsolvable language. The Etruscans. Of all the mysteries ancient DNA was expected to solve in Italy, the Etruscans ranked highest. Here was a civilization that had dominated central Italy for centuries, built extraordinary cities, pioneered art forms the Romans would later absorb and claim as their own, and spoken a language so alien to everything around it that modern linguists still cannot fully decode it. The question of where they came from had haunted researchers since antiquity. Herodotus had his answer. He claimed they had migrated from Lydia in Anatolia. The 2007 mitochondrial study seemed to confirm it. And so, when an international team led by Cosimo Post at the University of Tübingen set out to sequence ancient Etruscan genomes directly, the expectation across the field was that they would finally place the Anatolian origin theory on solid genomic footing. They found nothing of the kind. The 2021 study analyzed 82 ancient genomes drawn from 12 archaeological sites across Etruria and southern Italy, spanning almost 2 millennia of burial evidence from 800 BC to 1000 AD. The researchers were looking for the Eastern Mediterranean signal Herodotus had described, some ancestral thread connecting the Etruscans back to Lydia, to Anatolia, to the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. Instead, they found that the Etruscans were genetically indistinguishable from the Latins living in nearby Rome. The same proportion of steppe ancestry, the same Neolithic farmer foundation, the same overall profile. Let that settle for a moment. Two civilizations, separated by a radically different language, distinct religious practices, entirely different artistic traditions, and different burial customs, and virtually identical DNA. The people who spoke the great unsolvable language of ancient Italy were, at the genomic level, the same people as their Latin-speaking neighbors. Pritchard told Science magazine directly that the Etruscans looked indistinguishable from the Latins around them. The Herodotus theory was not weakened by this finding. It was not complicated. It was demolished. And the 2007 mitochondrial study that had appeared to confirm it now stands as a textbook example of what happens when researchers build a grand narrative on one thin strand of evidence and assume it represents the whole rope. But the Etruscan finding opened a question even more unsettling than the one it closed. If the Etruscans carried steppe ancestry, and steppe ancestry is associated everywhere else in Europe with the spread of Indo-European languages, why did the Etruscans speak something that was emphatically not Indo-European? This was the rule breaker promised earlier. Every other population across the continent that absorbed significant steppe ancestry ended up speaking a language from the Indo-European family tree. The Etruscans were the exception that refuses to resolve cleanly. David Caramelli at the University of Florence offered the most compelling explanation. The Etruscan language predated the steppe arrivals and was simply resilient enough to survive the genetic turnover. New populations moving into Etruria did not overwrite the existing culture, they assimilated into it. The genes changed. The language persisted. The biological identity of the population was gradually transformed, while its cultural identity held firm. That explanation is plausible, even elegant, but it drives home an uncomfortable point with extraordinary sharpness. The assumption that genetic ancestry predicts cultural identity, the assumption that underwrote decades of population history and made the Herodotus theory feel so satisfying, is precisely the kind of shortcut that produces beautiful narratives and wrong conclusions. The Etruscans did not come from Anatolia. They were already there, and what replaced them genetically left their language for a time completely intact. Striking as that was, it was not the most disruptive finding in the data. That distinction belonged to what the DNA revealed about Rome itself. What the DNA revealed about Imperial Rome is, by any measure, the most dramatic finding in the entire dataset. It is the kind of result that makes researchers check their methodology twice, then a third time, before accepting that the numbers are simply telling the truth. During the imperial period, beginning around the 1st century AD, the genetic profile of people buried in and around Rome underwent a transformation so profound that it registered as one of the largest ancestry shifts ever documented in European history, outside of the original Neolithic transition. The ancestry composition of Central Italians swung heavily toward the Eastern Mediterranean. Pritchard's team quantified it at approximately 50% admixture with Eastern Mediterranean populations, and this was not one laboratory chasing a ghost in its own data. A separate study, led by Margaret Antonio and Jonathan Pritchard at Stanford, analyzing 127 ancient genomes from 29 archaeological sites in and around Rome across 12,000 years of continuous habitation, captured the same signal independently. People interred in Imperial-era Rome looked genetically less like their own Iron Age predecessors and more like contemporaries living in Syria, Lebanon, and western Anatolia. The city that built the Colosseum, codified Roman law, and constructed the most sophisticated administrative system the ancient world had ever seen was, in biological terms, as Near Eastern as it was European. The mechanism was the empire itself. At its peak, Rome controlled territory stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, governing roughly 70 million people. Enslaved people poured into the capital from the eastern provinces. So did freed people, merchants, soldiers completing their service, administrators, and craftsmen drawn by opportunity in the largest city in the Western world. And the critical detail is geography. The eastern Mediterranean was far more densely populated than Gaul, Hispania, or Britannia. The net demographic flow ran consistently westward, toward Rome, and it was rapid enough to reshape the city's ancestry profile within a few generations. Rome did not merely conquer the East moved to Rome. A 2025 study published in Genome Biology and Evolution by researchers at Oxford pushed the timeline back even further. The Eastern Mediterranean genetic signal was already appearing in Central Italian individuals dated to the late Republican period, roughly 200 years before the empire formally began under Augustus. The shift was underway during the Punic Wars, during the conquest of Greece, during the annexation of the eastern provinces. Ancient DNA was tracking Roman military and economic expansion more precisely than any surviving historical text. Three things lock this transformation into place beyond reasonable doubt. First, the Eastern Mediterranean shift appears simultaneously across multiple independent burial sites in and around Rome, replicated by different research teams using different sequencing platforms and different statistical models. This is not a fluke of one cemetery or one study. Second, that consistency rules out contamination, modern admixture, and sampling bias. Third, and most profoundly, it implies that the genetic identity of a civilization is not fixed by its founders. The Romans constructed institutions that would shape the Western world for millennia, but the people living under those institutions were in constant, dramatic flux. Sit with the scale of it. Within 300 years of imperial expansion, the genomic distance between an Imperial Roman and an Iron Age Roman was comparable to the distance between modern populations in entirely different countries. The same streets, the same name, the same eternal city, occupied by a genetically different people. The Romans built an eternal city. They did not build an eternal people. And when the empire finally collapsed, another wave was already forming beyond the Alps. When Rome fell, the peninsula did not stabilize. It absorbed another wave. In 568 AD, the Lombards crossed from Pannonia into northern Italy, beginning a conquest that would reshape the political and, as ancient DNA now confirms, the genetic landscape of the peninsula for centuries to come. The Lombards were a Germanic people, and for a long time, historians debated whether their arrival represented a genuine mass migration or simply a change of rulers, a military elite imposing itself on an existing population without altering its biological composition. Ancient DNA has settled that debate. A 2018 study published in Nature Communications analyzed Lombard burials in both Hungary and Italy and found strong genetic similarities between the two groups, confirming a genuine folk migration, families included. Not merely soldiers and commanders, but entire communities relocating across the Alps. These were not Italians with Germanic rulers. These were Germanic people who became Italians over generations. But here's the detail that matters most for understanding modern Italy. The Lombards did not reach everywhere. They never took Sardinia. They never fully controlled Sicily, Calabria, or coastal Puglia, regions that remained under Byzantine governance, keeping their connections to the Eastern Mediterranean world that Imperial Rome had already drawn so deeply into the peninsula. This uneven coverage was not a political footnote. It carved a genetic fault line directly through Italy, one still measurable today. Greek colonization deepened that divide further. Beginning in the 8th century BC, Greek settlers established colonies along the southern coasts and across Sicily on such an extraordinary scale that the Romans later called the whole region Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. Syracuse, Naples, Taranto, Reggio Calabria all began as Greek foundations. These were full settlements with temples and theaters, and their populations intermarried with local Italic peoples across centuries, leaving a signature that survived the Roman period, the Arab Emirate in Sicily, the Norman conquest, and 5 centuries of Spanish rule. When researchers mapped the genetic structure of 1,616 modern Italians, drawn from all 20 administrative regions in a 2019 study published in Science Advances, what they found was remarkable. Italy contains the largest degree of genetic population structure detected in any single European country. 3 distinct clusters emerged: Northern Italy, including Tuscany, Southern Italy, including Sicily, and Sardinia, standing entirely apart from both. Southern Italians are genetically closest to modern Greeks. Northern Italians cluster with Spaniards and Southern French. And Sardinians, as before, preserve a profile closer to Stone Age farmers than to almost anyone else alive in Europe. Every wave, mapped onto the living population, layer by layer, conquest by conquest. Not everyone accepts the full weight of these findings. Some researchers argue for continuity, that the framework was established by the Bronze Age, and everything since has been adjustment at the margins. It is a position with the appeal of restraint, but it becomes difficult to defend against the actual numbers. 50% Eastern Mediterranean admixture in Imperial-era Central Italy is not adjustment at the margins. It is a population-scale transformation, and the Lombard migration, once dismissed as elite imposition, has now been confirmed as a genuine population movement with families in tow. The deeper layers only sharpen the point. A 2024 study on the Piscine culture found that Iron Age Italy was culturally fragmented but genetically cohesive, which makes the imperial disruption that followed all the more striking. And a 2025 study on Bronze Age Calabria found the Deep South had already diverged genetically before Rome. The peninsula was never a single genetic unit. The clean story was never clean, it was simply unexamined. Stand at a bus stop in Rome today, and you are standing on 12,000 years of genetic layering. Ice Age survivors sheltering in Mediterranean refugia, Anatolian farmers who crossed the sea and rewrote a continent, steppe pastoralists riding out of the grasslands north of the Black Sea, an empire that drew Syria and Lebanon and Egypt into the genome of its capital within a few generations, Germanic Lombards descending from the Alps, every wave still present, every layer still measurable. Italy was never a bloodline, it was always a crossroads, and the technology capable of reading these layers has existed for less than a decade. The next petrous bone pulled from an Italian necropolis could rewrite this story again. That is not speculation. At this point, it is simply the pattern. And if the descendants of Rome's founders were already a different people within 300 years, what does that tell us about every story a nation tells itself?